You just want to say something?
Good morning, Judge Kane.
Good morning.
Looks like we're good.
It's May the 22nd, 2019, and we're on the third day of this filming.
I thought it would never get here.
We talked a lot yesterday about your views of law school training and your employment of law clerks. And I wonder if we could spend some time getting your views about the state of the judiciary today. I know that's a pretty general topic, but I also know you have a lot of views about it.
Well, I do. At the present time, with what's going on in Washington with the persistent ignoring of the rule of law, and a lot of these issues have come before different judges around the country. So far, I've been very, very proud of my fellow judges around the country for the rulings they've made. They haven't gone into the political muck of the executive and legislative branches, and they've ruled according to law, and I think they've done an excellent job of it. So I think that these heavy challenges that are facing the judiciary right now are being met with what judges have to do, and that's to stick to the law. And we're always accused one way or another. I think that it's utterly senseless to talk about somebody being a liberal or a conservative judge. What it boils down to is calling a judge something that you think is pejorative if you don't like the judge, or that you think is complimentary if you do. So somebody who is politically liberal will say that some judge is liberal, and that's meant as a compliment, and he will say that some judge is conservative, and that's meant as a criticism. And the other side of the coin is that a conservative will say liberal as a pejorative term and conservative as a compliment, but there's no substance to either one of them. The terms have been used for so long, and they're used devoid of their historic context and meaning. So I don't use those, and I don't think it's appropriate to say that somebody is a liberal or a conservative judge. I think that the main thing is the judge a scholar, and is the judge active in applying the law? Now, I'm not referring to the Supreme Court because they're not bound by precedent, but appellate judges are, and so are trial judges. And I think overall, the judicial branch of the government does a very good job. I do think that the selection process is not what it should be. And that depends too much on, and it has over the past 30 years, too much on political considerations rather than examining what the judge has done in the past and the quality of the judge's work. So overall, I think that the third branch has, and I think public opinion polls show this as well, that it's the most respected branch of government. There's always the pejorative term of an active judge, or judicial activism, and if that means that the judge thinks ahead of time of the result that he wants to get to because of some social or economic significance to it, that's bad, and there are judges who have done that in the past. But the other problem is just as bad, and that's judicial timidity, when a judge has to take a stand that isn't necessarily popular, and frequently that happens. And I know certainly we've talked about Ramos versus Lamb, the prisoner rights case, and I got a lot of hate mail over that, But I also got mail from members of the public who said, thank you, it's about time. Now, I can't let those things interfere with what I'm doing, but I think, who was it, the author of Mr. Dooley, I can't think of it, Peter, somebody who wrote, and he said, Mr. Dooley said, even the Supreme Court reads the newspapers. I think we're akin to what's going on in our society, but we can't be controlled by that. So what I don't like is the fact that it happens all too often that federal judges are selected on the basis of some political preference. And the point is that when you get to the bench, you have to stop politics anyway. But that's the criterion. And I'm surprised, frankly, that the quality of judges is as good as it is, considering the selection process being so dominated by politics. Now, magistrate judges, totally different thing. They're selected in a way that's very similar to the way I was with a merit selection panel. By statute, there's a panel in the local district, and people apply to become a magistrate judge, and the panel, which is required to be constituted of some lawyers, but not all, some non-lawyers, and they sift through the applications and conduct interviews, and then they submit a short list of names to the district court, and the judges then vote on who's been nominated by this process. And I think that means that the judges are looking for people who are good at law, for people who have demonstrated success in the sense of being respected by the legal profession when they become magistrate judges. And while I disagree emphatically with what's happened with magistrate judges, I think that the individual magistrate judges are really excellent, the ones we have.
Let's talk about your views of the role of magistrate judges. You and Judge Maitch, I know, have declined to use magistrate judges on a sort of a routine basis, and I think you have some views about whether or not, under the Constitution, they should be allowed to do jury trials.
I do.
Could you tell us what your views are?
Right. My views coincide with Judge Maitch, which is very reassuring. Whenever I find my views the same as his, I have a lot of confidence in him. The magistrate judges evolved from a position that was called the United States Commissioner, and the commissioner was placed in areas where there was no judge available, and such as national parks, and also in distant areas such as Colorado is one federal judicial district, and so it can take a long time to get across the Continental Divide to Grand Junction, or to try and get all the way to Durango, which is about in good weather a 6-hour drive. So they had commissioners, and they would try petty offense cases. Somebody speeding in a national forest, or having a tent there in a place that a permit was required and they didn't have one, that sort of thing. And they also would handle the initial arrests of people. For instance, in Durango, it's in the proximity are 2 Ute reservations, and when a crime was committed on an Indian reservation, the state did not have jurisdiction, the federal government does, and the magistrates would handle those preliminary proceedings. That grew to the point where it was changed from a commissioner by the time I became a judge to magistrate. And the magistrates handled these same petty offenses, and they also handled the initial bond setting and arraignments for district court cases, criminal cases, and they, I believe that they had the authority at that time as well to issue search warrants. So they were busy, and they were performing these judicial tasks under the supervision of the judge. There was pressure, a great deal of political pressure exerted, my understanding, by the administrators of the court system in Washington, as well as the magistrates who had organized, and they wanted to increase the authority. And the law was changed to call them magistrate judges. And eventually, the magistrate part, for the most part, was ignored by many, and they were just called judge. And then there was an expansion to the point where, in civil cases, the judges were referring matters to magistrate judges, and the magistrate judges would hear motions. If they were dispositive of the case, they would hear it and make a recommendation to the district judge, who would then either accept and approve the recommendation or reject it. And then on non-dispositive matters, such as discovery disputes, the magistrate judges were hearing those. And the original concept of this expansion was to make magistrate judges case managers. And we would, as judges, interview the applicants, and I can tell you that without exception, every single one that I was participating in the interview, every single one of them would say, "Oh, I don't want to try cases. I want to be a case manager, and I want to try and settle cases and keep case management on an efficient basis." And every one of them said that, and within a week after taking office, they started their campaign to get authority to try cases. Now, the present situation is that they do not have the authority to try criminal cases, but in civil cases, the courts, most of them in the United States, have authorized cases to be referred to magistrates for trial, including jury trials. And Judge Mach and I and others around the country, not in the majority, but others, believe that that's a violation of Article 3 of the United States Constitution. That Article 3 is the part of the Constitution dealing with the creation and organization of the judicial branch of government. And it says specifically that cases tried in the federal courts shall be tried by judges appointed under this article. Well, magistrate judges are not. And the most significant aspect of it is that the Article 3 judges, such as I am, Judge Mach and others, are appointed for life during our good behavior. And it's been a very, very rare thing throughout U.S. history for a federal district judge to be impeached. It has happened, but that's the only way to remove them for high crimes and misdemeanors, by an impeachment in trial in the U.S. Senate. There have been a few judges who have engaged in some misconduct, Article 3 judges, who have been confronted with the idea of impeachment, and they have resigned from the bench under pressure. But magistrate judges are appointed for a term, and I believe it's 8 years. This is the problem with that. They're good people, and I'm definitely not trying to criticize any of these people and their personalities or the individuals. It's the structure that I object to. And the reason for that is that the present system for selecting Article 3 judges is that the president nominates and the Senate gives its advice and consent. But in that nomination process, the Department of Justice gives its approval or disapproval to the White House. And so if a person doesn't meet the, doesn't receive the approval of the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, that person's not going to be nominated by the President. So here's the dilemma. You have somebody who is appointed to a judicial capacity as a magistrate judge, and that person, however well-intentioned they are, almost all of them want to become Article III judges and have the independence, which is the very core of being a judge, to have judicial independence. And the lifetime appointment gives you that independence so that you can make decisions such as Ramos versus Lamb, whereas a state judge who is elected would make the same decision I did, and the next election he'd be out of office because of the political processes that are involved. Well, to come back to the magistrate judges, they know that the Justice Department has to approve of their nomination if they're going to be made an Article III judge. And they can, with all of their effort and integrity, can say that doesn't make a difference to them, but they know that if they rule against the government, that they run the risk of not getting approval from the Department of Justice. And the more politically oriented the Attorney General of the United States is, whoever it might be, the greater is the danger of having people approved by the Department of Justice for nomination on the basis of their having ruled in the past in the favor of the government. So I think that it affects the very nature of judicial independence, but more importantly, it's spelled out in the Constitution. And if you read the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton wrote on this point specifically. It's to give judges the independence so they're not subject to the control, as at the time of the American Revolution, as the colonial judges appointed by the King of England did what they were told, or they were removed from office. And that's one of the things that the Founding Fathers wanted to avoid. It's one of the many things that Madison and Hamilton agreed upon and wrote about in the Federalist Papers, is this essential need for judicial independence so that a judge can rule according to law, irrespective of fear or favor from the public. I think that that's essential, and more importantly, it's what the Constitution requires. But our court system has engaged in what I believe to be unconscionable sophistry to get around that. And what they do, they take some incidental language from an opinion when Justice Kennedy was sitting on the Ninth Circuit, and he wrote an opinion for the Ninth Circuit and said that a magistrate judge could do things as long as he or she was under the direction and supervision of an Article III judge. And I believe, as I remember that case, there was a magistrate judge who, an Article III judge, asked him to select the jury for a trial, and that he did, and then after that was, the jury was selected, then the Article III judge tried the case. And so just then Judge Kennedy and the Ninth Circuit said, well, that's all right, because if there was anything wrong, the Article III judge could correct it. So they took this principle that of being under the direction of an Article III judge and engaged in what I think of as unconscionable sophistry. And that's that they say, well, all of the cases that we draw now to magistrate judges, the same as with Article III judges, all the civil cases, they go in the draw just like we do. But they say, well, actually they're all assigned to the chief judge of the district, and the chief judge of the district supervises these magistrate judges, and therefore it doesn't violate Article III. And we had that fight in our court, a very serious one, and Judge Mach and I, frankly, don't go to judges' meetings anymore because we believe that they're violating the Constitution. And in practical terms, what that means for me is I do not refer matters to magistrate judges, nor does Judge Mach, with one exception, and that is that if the parties want to engage in settlement and mediation, then I will send it to a magistrate judge, because I instruct them, I don't want to know what goes on in settlement negotiations. That interferes with my judgment trying to decide issues that are presented during trial or on pretrial motions. If I know who's being greedy and who's being unreasonable and who's doing all this sort of thing in the negotiation process, that can affect my judgment. So when a case is assigned to me for trial, I do not engage in the settlement efforts, and I refer those to magistrate judges. I do sit to try and settle cases when I'm asked by another judge to do that on a case pending before the other judge. But other than that, there are a few occasions when a magistrate judge, in addition to the settlement conferences, will assist me on a case management matter. For instance, just recently I had 35 cases all filed against the same company, and you have to put those together to consolidate the discovery process and all the pretrial processes. And I called on a magistrate judge in whom I have the greatest confidence to meet with these lawyers and get them to agree on a common plan, case management plan, which was then will be submitted to me for approval. So, but that's a rare circumstance. But I will not refer a case for trial to a magistrate judge, and I do not agree with the practice of this court in doing so.
It appears to me that throughout the country, most discovery disputes in civil matters, and some in criminal matters, including classified information review, get referred to magistrate judges by many district judges.
That's true.
Just to avoid the volume of paper that.
Well, it looks nice if the courts were an MBA program, it would make a lot of sense that there's a certain administrative efficiency to doing it this way. And it's also, Congress likes the idea, and it's a matter of record, it's not speculation on my part, but Congress likes the idea that it's less expensive to maintain the facilities and support staff necessary for a magistrate judge than it is for an Article III judge. And they also understand the opinion polls that the judicial branch and Article III judges are held in very high regard, and the Congress of the United States is not. So there's a resentment, and there's a resentment that on the part of some politicians that Article III judges do not have to participate in politics or run for re-election. And so they feel that there's a lack of accountability. That's wrong. No one has a job in which there's greater accountability than a district judge, a United States district judge. Every single decision we make has at least two sides to it, and frequently with multi-party cases more than that. And we have a court of appeals perched across the street to review, and every single decision that's made is subject to review. That's not true with congressmen. It's not true with executive branch people. They don't have to read the regulations that govern their agencies. But when we have a case, we have to read them, and we're held accountable for it. So I think the accountability argument is facetious to criticize judges. We are accountable.
Let me ask you another general question on which I know you have strong views. What do you think the most effective traits are of lawyers who appear before you? Well,
I do have strong views about that. the most effective lawyers, I think, recognize and believe, especially in jury trials, but likewise just appearing in front of a judge, that the lawyer is an officer of the court. And you are confronted as a lawyer, I see this all the time, of seminars that are sponsored by different bar organizations and private profit-making organizations for continuing legal education, and you see these things like how to establish rapport with the jury. That's utter nonsense. I have spent 41 years talking to jurors after the verdicts, and what they're looking for is somebody that they can trust. And so the lawyer who comes in and tries to be, you know, pals and friendly and establish this kind of rapport is being ineffective. They want somebody they can believe in, and the way they find that is when the lawyer makes an objection, the judge maybe rules against him or for him, but they see that the judge is making, that the lawyer is making an argument, and that the lawyer has training and discipline. And that's what makes for a very effective lawyer in front of a jury, because the lawyer is in, like it or not, in our permissive society, the lawyer is in a position of authority, considerable authority, and we call them and believe it to be the case that they are officers of the court when they're in trial and they're trying a case and representing somebody. And if a lawyer does not prepare and fumbles around, the judge knows that. The credibility of the lawyer craters if he has no idea what he's talking about. And if occasionally you get lawyers who intentionally try to mislead you, but that's very rare. More often than not, what you get is a lawyer that searches for a case that supports his or her position, and they read into the case something which the judge doesn't read into the case. So that's why you get questions from the bench of how does that apply? How does the case you cite apply to the case in front of me? And if the lawyer hasn't read the case and just cites it anyway, then his or her effectiveness as an advocate has been reduced to zero. So that's one thing. Another is to see lawyers that engage in ad hominem attacks upon the opposing counsel as though it's some kind of a barroom brawl. And that diminishes the persuasive power of the attorney. So an attorney who acts with dignity and integrity and treats other people, witnesses and opposing counsel in the court with respect is going to get respect back and be effective in persuading people. The other thing we see is a lot of briefs, and I confess when I was a lawyer I did this myself sometimes, but fortunately I had some mentors that told me to knock it off. But that's sarcasm and attacks of an opposing counsel in a brief. The opposing counsel is not on trial, and gratuitous insults are distracting. So I'd say that the most effective lawyers are the ones that are resourceful, are well prepared, and conduct themselves with a sense of dignity and integrity. And the idea that they are zealous is demonstrated by the quality of their representation, not by the volume of it. And that's why I mentioned earlier one of the best lawyers I've ever had in my court was Doris Besikoff with the Song versus the Air Force case, because she was totally dignified. One lawyer, solo practitioner in the remote state of Denver, Colorado, taking on the entire Defense Department, the Secretary of the Air Force, and all the resources that are there. And she did it with grace and dignity and with considerable analytic ability.
One of the lawyers in Colorado who really is iconic and has been for the last century is your former law partner, Irving Andrews. And I know we talked a bit about Irving earlier, but could you expand on what made him as great as he was?
Yes. Irving's an African American to begin with. His father was in World War I and was gassed with mustard gas or something of that nature, and got out of the service and married Irving's mother, and they had Irving, and his name, his father's name was Piper, and Irving's original name was Irving Piper, and his father died, and his mother thereafter, when Irving was a tiny child, 2 or 3 years old, married a man named Holman Andrews, and Irving was adopted by Holman, and so his name became Irving Piper Andrews, and that's the Irving P. Andrews. I'm not going to call him his stepfather anymore because he was the adopted father, and Mr. Andrews worked in Pueblo at the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, and he had a job that was somewhat characteristic of black employees in those days, is that after the smelter and the crew were in and melted all the ore to make the metal to make what CF&I did mostly was manufacture barbed wire, and they had to have a cleanup crew, and he was the cleanup crew, or part of it, and they were paid less than the white workers who were doing the work in front of the ovens, but it was an unfair situation. But that's what, especially in the 20s and 30s, what black people did. They took menial jobs, and so they lived in Pueblo, and Irving was an only child. Holman Andrews and Irving's mother did not have any more children. And they lived in a neighborhood where there were some people who they were close to the steel mill, and there were some people there who didn't like the idea that black people were in their neighborhood, and to the extent that, not all of them certainly, but some wouldn't allow their children to play with Irving, or Irving to play with their children. And his mother's response to that was, there's a branch library at the end of the block, go there and read. And he started reading before he went to grade school, and it became an essential part of his life, more so than with other people because of a certain kind of isolation that he had. But he was also highly, highly intelligent, and when he went to high school, he had friends, and he excelled in high school, academically especially, and that was in Pueblo. And then World War II came, and he enlisted in the United States Navy. And in those days, the Navy was segregated, and he, almost all black sailors, there were no black officers, and almost all black sailors worked as stewards in the kitchens on board ship and in the various naval bases, and did food service and janitorial service, that sort of thing. But Irving could type very well, and Irving could read very well. And so he was made a yeoman, which is Navy language, as I understand it, but not being a Navy person, but a yeoman is somebody from the old days who could read and write, and not all of them could. So a yeoman is, as I understand it, a secretary, and or office worker doing typing and so on. So Irving was sent to wartime conditions, apparently was as a couple of Quonset huts. So they constructed a separate room in another Quonset hut for him to live in, and he couldn't associate with anybody, and he read. Again, his constant companion was reading. And so by the time the war was over and he received a scholarship to Colorado College, where he majored in economics, he was thoroughly familiar with Shakespeare and with the Greek writers, the classics, and a great deal of philosophic works and more contemporary literature. And he excelled in debate. And a former partner of mine at home, Robert Snow, and Edgar Vinton was a classmate, and the two of them became debaters at Colorado College, and they won lots of competitive debates. So he graduated very high in his class and with honors, and he came to Denver, where he went to the University of Denver Law School. And in those days, when you took the bar exam, they posted the results according to the score, so you could tell who was number one on the bar, number two, number three, in terms of the scores that they had received. And Irving was number one, and there were some other very high-profile lawyers that were 2, 3, and 4 at that time. But he was working he was on the GI Bill, and he was also working as a janitor at the Glenarm branch of the YMCA, which was in the black section of Denver. And the membership was, I don't think it was exclusive, but almost exclusively African American. So when he was admitted to the bar, the African American councilman on the Denver City Council went to the mayor and said, you haven't hired any of our people in any position, and here's this lawyer. He's a military veteran and number one on the bar, and our constituency has always supported you, and we want, the councilman said, I want you to get him a job. And so the mayor notified the city attorney that there was somebody coming over that he wanted to be appointed as an assistant city attorney. And so Irving sent his application, and it went to the then city attorney, who, as I recall, his name was Henry Banks. And when this black man walked into his office for an interview, he took the file and tossed it in the outbox and turned around and put his feet on the radiator, staring out the window, and over his shoulder said, somebody will be in touch with you. Somebody will give you a call. And as Irving gave a speech once, he said, I've been waiting 45 years and that phone hasn't rung yet. So he didn't get the job, and what he had to do was to just start a practice on the basis of people that would, in the African American community, would realize he was a lawyer, and if they had a traffic case or anything else, they would start seeing him. And he gradually built up a practice almost exclusively African American clients, and eventually was able to have a fairly successful practice. And he did a lot of criminal work, and his work was never ever office practice, drafting wills and estates or forming corporations or doing that kind of transactional work. He was a trial lawyer, and he was in trial every single day. And he would have maybe 7 or 8 different clients with different cases in the county court and the district court that he would handle in a day. And then he'd come back to his office. Well, after a few years, there were a great many people that wanted him to represent them, and there was no public defender system at the time. And he took on another lawyer as a partner, a man named Bob Rohn, and who was also black, and they had a firm of Andrews and Rohn. And what he excelled in was an immediate grasp of legal issues. He just understood the law almost by osmosis. He had an immediate grasp of what was going on, and The other thing was he had this phenomenal memory. I keep hearing people say photographic memory. I think that's an exaggeration, but he had a phenomenal memory. He would read something and he would remember it. He would see something or hear something and he would remember it. And unlike most lawyers, he did not use notes when he was in trial. He listened. And I'll give you one example of how he did this that it was tremendous. He had a client, an African American, who was successful in developing a business where he had these trucks, the trash hauling trucks, with the hydraulic thing in the back, and people would put their trash barrels out, and these trucks would come and pick them up. And he was indicted for income tax evasion, and it was in front of Judge Araj. The prosecution put on their witnesses, and one of them, the key witness, was this defendant's CPA. And he, in the parlance of the trade, flipped on his client and testifying for the government. Of course, he gave me all this information. I relied upon it, and I did not do an audit because we don't do those in normal sort of tax return. And I just honestly put down everything that he gave me. So the false information came from him, not from me. And that's what the CPA testified to. And Judge Araj ran a very, very regulated, prompt court. He started at 9 o'clock, not at 9:01. He took a recess at 10:15, not 10:16. And he recessed for lunch in the middle of a gavel blow right at noon to come back at 1:15 or 1:30. So they put this fellow on the stand and direct examination, and the CPA, and they finished the exam at about 10 minutes before 12. Well, Judge Araj is the sort of fellow that would say, well, you have 10 minutes, then we'll recess in during your cross-examination, come back and finish it. And Irving stood up and he said, Your Honor, he said, I have a special request. And Judge Araj liked Irving because Irving was good, and that's what Judge Araj liked. And so he said, what is it? And he said, well, he said, I know you want to go until noon, but he said, my request is that this witness go back to his office and retrieve his diploma and bring it back to court with him so that I can cross-examine him, and I want his diploma here. And Judge Araj said, well, all right, Irving. So he reluctantly recessed 10 minutes early, and sure enough, they came back, and this guy had his diploma there. And Irving put it up. In those days, a lot of, before the computers, x-rays would be used in court. So almost every court had one of these illuminating screens that you could put x-rays on to see it. And so he took this diploma and put it up on this lamp, this x-ray lamp, and you could see that it had been altered. And then Irving started to cross-examine him, and he said, the fellow had testified he was a CPA and he graduated from the University of Denver, and he had a BA in accounting, and he had gone on to testify in direct examination. And so Irving started cross-examining him, and he said, you didn't go to DU, did you? And you altered this certificate, didn't you? And he had the fellow admit on the stand that he had never graduated, was not really a CPA, did not have any of the licenses that he had falsely testified to, and that he had conducted his business with. So the jury was not out for a very long time, and they acquitted Irving's client. And Judge Araj said, when the verdict came in, he said, Mr. Andrews, I'd like to see you in chambers. And at that time, I was a public defender in Adams County, but I came down to see Irving, and I was gonna watch his closing argument and so forth. So he asked Judge Raj if I could join him, and he said, sure. So I was there when this happened. And we came into the judge's chambers, and he said, Irving, he said, I've never seen anything like that happen before in my entire career. He said, how did you know that that witness was lying? And he said, because I listened. He said he had a BA in accounting from the University of Denver, and the University of Denver gives a Bachelor of Science, not a Bachelor of Arts in accounting. That one little teeny detail, and he had been listening without taking notes, and he knew it. And that's what he used. That's to give you an example of the presence of mind and the incisiveness that he had. He did phenomenal things. I saw him when I was a law student, and he gave an argument on a murder case, and there were jurors crying in the jury box during his closing argument. And he could go from just the flow, the articulate quality of his arguments and so on, but he would say, well, as King Lear says, and he would quote from Shakespeare, and then he'd say, you know, as Thucydides said, and he would quote from Thucydides, and it didn't seem, well, it was awe-inspiring. You'd say, how could anybody know all this? But it was articulate, it was fluent, and very intimidating too.
He mesmerized jurors of all ethnicities.
Oh,
white,
yeah.
white, black,
That's right.
brown, at a time when there was enormous racial tension in this country.
And one of the things that I think it's fair to say that I never ever recall him playing the race card, ever. He just didn't try cases that way, appealing to guilt of people with racial prejudice, or appealing to people that were pro minorities. He just didn't do that. He stayed with the structure and the analysis of the case. I'll give you one other example. He had a marvelous characteristic that mostly when a lawyer makes an objection, the lawyer will say, I object, that's hearsay, and the attorney on the other side says, this is an exception to the hearsay rule, and would make an argument, and the judge listens and then either sustains or overrules the objection. Well, Irving didn't do that. When he made an objection, he would, especially in the state courts, he would say, objection, and then he'd cite the case. And he'd say, such as, objection, Smith versus the People, 77 Colorado 204. And then he'd sit down, and he would look with this great look at the expression he had. I've said it all. And so Judge Edward J. Keating, he was in his court. I was with him. We were trying a murder case, and he did that. And Judge Keating, in front of the jury, said, all right. He called all lawyers captain. And he said, all right, captain. He said, I'm calling you on that. And he turned to the jury and sort of preened at them and said, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Mr. Andrews has just said that he knows this specific case, and we're going to find out about it. So you go back to the jury room, and we're going to go to chambers. And so we all went into chambers, and he had the court reporter, and he said, what's that case, what's that citation? And she looked at her notes and gave it to him. And so the judge walked over to, before the computers, judges had books in our chambers, and he walked over to the Colorado reports, and he pulled it out, and he opened it up, and he says, and he says, well, I'll be damned, Irving, you're right. And he said, I'm sorry. And Irving looked at him, and he says, oh, no, you're not. You dressed me down in front of that jury. You dressed me up in front of that jury. And we went back out, and the judge actually apologized to the jury. He said, Mr. Andrews was right. but that's kind of one of the things that he would do. He had just a withering wit and ability to cross-examine, and it was not done. I have to go back a little bit. When he started out, there was no active legal aid society or public defender system, and he represented people with no money or very, very little. And so in a civil case, for instance, even though the rules provide for taking depositions and for written interrogatories, his clients couldn't afford that. And his high volume practice, he couldn't spend any time doing that. So he tried cases in court without having had depositions and so forth. And when I went to work for him, he came into my office and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm sending out a notice to take depositions in this case." He said, "Oh, no, you're not. Not in this office." He said, "Why would you take a deposition and tell the other side everything about what you're going to do in trial?" And I said, "Well, I need to find out what it is." He said, "You find that out when he testifies." He said, "You listen." And that's how he cross-examined. Intense concentration. But he was so well read. And he would write a brief, and it wasn't simply, it had the case law in the brief, but he also had writings from outside of the law. Marshall McLuhan, for instance, was one of the people that he had read, and he just would quote him in briefs. That he had that ability and tenaciousness too. So
Let me,
we also had a lot of laughs.
let me shift gears and talk about your family.
Can I go back to Irving for one more time?
You can go back to Irving many times as you want.
Well, this is another story about Irving. I said we had a lot of laughs. It was fun too. Irving had a client who was a black man who was somewhere over 6'3". He was very tall, and I doubt that he weighed 130 pounds. He was just very easily identifiable because he was so tall and so skinny, and he liked to rob banks. So he went to the Silver State Savings and Loan at Colfax and Grant Street, and he went in and he held up the bank, and they gave him a sack of one of those canvas bags with money in it, and he left, and they turned on the alarm as soon as he left, and he ran, and the police were chasing him, and he ran into Irving's office, and as I tried to describe it earlier, there were so many clients. The office was on the second floor of this old renovated mansion, and on every step there'd be a client, and when he talked to somebody, or I would, and then they would leave, and everyone would take one step up and come into the office and move along the sofa until they got in to see one or the other of us. And he handled maybe 5 times as many as I did. But he'd listen and so on. So he was in there with some client, and this guy comes running in with the police chasing him, not too far behind, and he comes in and he said, it's somewhat characteristic of African Americans to say attorney rather than Mr. to a lawyer. And so he came in and he says, Attorney Andrews. He says, "I just robbed a bank and the police are chasing me." And Irving looked over and he said, "Do you have an appointment?" The guy's standing there, and he said, "Fool, you have no idea whether you robbed a bank or not. You're not smart enough to know the constituent elements of the offense." And then Detective Tyus and the other cops came in, and they put the handcuffs on this guy.
In Irving's office?
In Irving's office. And as he's walking out, he says, "Attorney Andrews thinks I might be innocent." But it's that sort of presence of mind that he had. It was so great. Okay.
I want to totally shift gears to matters personal, and we talked about in the early part of our discussion how you grew up and briefly talked about your children. I'd like to sort of play that forward, and I know you have 4 children. Could you
Sure.
discuss each one of them and what their paths have been?
I will, and to give you the summary first, but I have 3 daughters and 1 son, and I have 11 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. Now, to go back, as I mentioned earlier, the custody was such that my oldest daughters and all my daughters actually came in and lived with me while they were in high school, and my son came in grade school, and then for high school he went away to prep school. So the oldest girl, Molly, she was a gifted child. We lived in Brighton, and when she went to the first grade, or kindergarten rather, the kindergarten teacher came to the house and she said, "I'd be fired if I said this, and anybody knew about it." But she said, "You have to get your daughter out of this school. We don't have the facilities or the equipment or the training or people to deal with a gifted child." And said, "She's already reading at an 8th grade level and she's 5 years old." And so they said, "She needs to go to a special school." And so we, my then wife and I, we searched, and there wasn't any place except to come to Denver. So my ex-wife's parents lived in Denver, and we made arrangements for Molly to go to Grayland Country Day School, and they had an ability to handle gifted children. So we would take her in, and then before we moved to Denver, Molly would, I'd take her in on a Monday morning, and then she would spend Monday and Tuesday nights with her grandparents, and on Wednesday I'd pick her up and bring her home, and then on Thursday take her back to the school, and she'd spend Thursday night with her grandparents, and then on Friday I'd pick her up and she would be back with us. And then when we went to India, she went to an international school there, and that was a marvelous experience. From the time she was in the first grade, she'd taken French, and when she went to this international school in Calcutta, she also continued with French. So by the time she was in the 8th grade, she was fluent in French as well as English. And there was the Rotary International had, I think they still do, a student exchange program where they give a scholarship to an American student to go and spend a year overseas in a different country and going to school. And Molly applied for and was selected by the Denver Rotary. And so for 9th grade, she went to the Philippines. And she spent a year in this Philippine town outside of Manila. I think it was, memory serves, it was called Pagsang John. And she was with a family that spoke Tagalog. And so she picked up on Tagalog as well as the school was taught in English, but she kept up with these 3 languages. And she came back after a year overseas in the Philippines, and she went to East High School, and she took all accelerated advanced placement courses. And then when she was a senior, and we were considering what college to go to, that she should go to, she looked at all these various handbooks, and she talked to the high school counselors. And we had a friend who had been active in Ted Kennedy's campaign, traveling all over the United States to organize college-age students. So she was familiar with all these various colleges, and she came over to the house, and Molly was talking to her, and they came, and she was describing the school and what kind of programs they had and whether it was worth her applying to it or not. And I'm sitting there thinking of ka-ching, 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 the cash register as to how much this is going to cost. And they weren't looking at local schools. There was places like Vassar and Middlebury, and that was before Harvard and Yale were co-ed, but that was the quality of schools that they were looking at. And then all of a sudden she mentions McGill, which is in Montreal. And Molly said, what about McGill? And this woman that was talking to her said, well, if you could get in, it's the best school there is. And that's all she had to say. So she applied, and American students could go to Canada to McGill if they spoke French. And so she did. So she was admitted to McGill. And as best I recall, it was less expensive for me to send her to McGill than it would have been to the University of Colorado at Boulder, including airfare. It was remarkable. She admitted they had hardly any tuition at all, and it was just basically airfare, room and board, and so forth. But she went to McGill, and it was and is an outstanding place. And she majored in Asian studies that had a lot to do with her having been in the Philippines, and she also took Mandarin, and she studied Chinese, and she had a job starting in her freshman year for the YMCA. Canada does not have government agencies for everything. They frequently take a private organization and enter a contract. So for the example, the Canadian equivalent of Fulbright scholarships are administered by the YMCA. And the Salvation Army has a contract with the Canadian government to work in the Inuit country around Hudson Bay. They're not hung up on a First Amendment freedom of religion, separation of church and state the way that we are. So these organizations will contract with the government, and or perhaps it's with the university. I don't know, but at any rate, her job was to take these young people from different countries and help them to get adjusted in the dormitory and where the campus is and what kind of classes to take and what sort of rules and regulations there are that they might not be familiar with, and to familiarize themselves. That's what she did for her in her freshman year. And she said, I remember telling me, she says, I'm just telling them what I had to learn the hard way. There wasn't anybody around to help me, but this is what I do. And so the next year, they hired her to supervise other McGill students that were doing what she had done the previous year. And so she did that, and she became very active in student politics and feminism. And this young man who was the editor of the student newspaper at McGill wrote some sort of column about the feminist movement and how silly it was, and they shouldn't be doing whatever it was they were doing. And Molly grabbed a hold of a copy of his paper, and she marched right in the editorial offices, and she was trembling with rage. And she tells this guy, blah, blah, you don't know anything about it, and why are you belittling us? You should be helping us, and so forth. And she finally finished and ran out of breath, and he said, would you like to have dinner? And she married him. That was how they met. Then she worked, I think, for a year with the YMCA after that, and then she, in the course of her marriage, had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and she worked for different nonprofits, and I'll have to stop on that because we're going too far, but she spent her lifetime, she was born in 1958, and she spent her entire career with these nonprofits very similar to things like the Peace Corps and Amnesty International. And the focus of her attention was and still is Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. So she'd spent quite a bit of time in the Congo and in other African countries and helping to organize social programs and that sort of thing. And today, there's an organization in Canada called the Council of Canadians, and it's very, very similar to an organization we have in the United States, a Common Cause. They have chapters around the Canadian provinces the way Common Cause has chapters throughout the United States, and they deal with things like equal and fair voting and helping the, as the Canadians refer to them as First Americans, the Native American population that's there.
So,
And she's the executive director of this organization that has 40 subsidiary or 40 chapters throughout Canada, and that's what she does.
and she lives in Canada?
She lives in Canada, and her husband, or her son, is an engineer who went to Queen's College in Kingston, Ontario. And her daughter, Claire, is married and is a lawyer in Ottawa. And she went to McGill to law school. She went to Chapel Hill in the United States to undergraduate school. And that girl, my granddaughter Claire, is fluent in English, French, Mandarin, and Spanish, and has been an exchange student or part of her time at North Carolina in Nicaragua. She spent some time down there. So those two, and then the grandson, Jasper, has 2 children, a boy and a girl. Those are my 2 great-grandchildren. So that's Molly.
Tell us about your second daughter.
Megan. Megan is, and always has been, a very, very good artist. She draws and paints and does that sort of thing. And when she did not go to her senior year in high school, she went right into college after the 11th grade. And she went to a small college in Oregon, Willamette College in Salem. And she studied, I think, fine arts there. And then eventually, a year or so later, she came back to Colorado, and she went to the University of Colorado at Boulder. And she became very interested in child psychology. And she got involved with the Montessori system and graduated from college. And then while she was an undergraduate, she did an internship at a Montessori school. So when she graduated, she'd met this young man at Willamette, and he was a lacrosse player, and he came to Colorado for a lacrosse tournament at Vail, and he came down to Denver and saw her, and they ended up getting married. And so she lives in Bainbridge Island, which is right across Puget Sound from Seattle, and Montessori does not call them principal the way that we think of, or superintendent. They call the person that's the principal the head, and she is the head of a Montessori school that starts with nursery school and goes all the way through high school. And they had merged 3 or 4 different Montessori schools, a main campus to get to that point. And that's what she does. And she has 2 boys, a husband and 2 boys and a daughter. And the oldest boy was a captain of his lacrosse team. They're all lacrosse players. And he majored in biology, and he works for a company on the Olympic Peninsula where they're developing new hybrid species of trees that, because of the lumber industry, has been exhausting our natural forests. And this company is developing new trees for the lumber industry, and he works there. And then the next boy just graduated last year, also a lacrosse player, but he's in graduate school getting a master's degree in mathematics. And his their younger sister just is an undergraduate, and she spent a year in Germany and is back at the school the college that she goes to. And then Sally,
your third daughter?
Sally's my third daughter, and Sally is the one I mentioned earlier when I was working on all these murder cases, and I came home one day and she was sitting on the sidewalk and said, "Who are you?"
When she was 3 years old, she did not recognize you?
Yeah. And Sally's of all my children, she's the most dynamic one. She's just full of energy and I would say charismatic. She a very determined person. And when at one point she graduated from college, and she didn't like me to say this, but I said that she majored in dramatics and minored in hysteria. But what she did was she was in school at the same time as the Iran-Contra controversy was going on, and she headed up the students at Colorado State University that were protesting U.S. involvement with the Contras in Central America. And she was married. She's divorced now. She had 2 children. And when she was married, she and her husband had a very small ranch in near Paonia, Colorado, Crawford, Colorado. And there was a local radio station, community-owned radio station, and it was going broke. And she went into that. Some friends asked her to come in with them, and she did, and she led a community effort and refinanced it, and they built a new station and set up a volunteer system for people to come in and operate this community-owned radio station. And they belonged to or joined a national association of community-owned radio stations. And Sally went to this convention and ended up being on the board. And then after a few years, she became and is presently the executive director of the National Association of Community-Owned Radio Stations.
Are they affiliated with NPR?
Yes, yeah, and she sits on the advisory board of NPR, and she goes to all these local stations all over the United States, Alaska included, and helps the people to get organized and to finance and operate the volunteer support system that a community-owned radio station needs. And she helps with the programming, and there's an NPR program, national program, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, but you hear on NPR these stories that they tell about people.
This American Life?
Yeah, and that was one of her original projects to get that going. Anyway, she has 2 children, and her son has a master's degree in architecture and is in his first year of being, I don't know what, an articled architect. To get certified, you graduate from architecture school and you have to work for a licensed architect for 3 years before you can qualify as an independent architect. And he's in his first year at an architectural firm in San Antonio doing that. And her daughter is Tara, and Tara went to both of them were homeschooled in the Paonia area, along with about a dozen other kids. and because the parents didn't like the school system. And they had a lot of retired people, so she learned science from a retired physicist who had been with Lockheed and had settled there. His wife was a librarian and taught literature and English and library science to these kids. Another was an orthopedic surgeon, and he was retired and taught. So that was their home schooling. And when she was in the 11th grade, she learned of this organization called United World Colleges, and they have campuses all over the world. What they do is they take 50 students from a home country and 50 students from around the world, and they put them all together into a class, and it lasts for 2 years. So there are 200 students, and it is the International Baccalaureate program. So she went to that United World College. There's one in Wales. They name them after famous people, and so the Anur and Bevan United World College is in Wales. And there's another one, the Dag Hammarskjöld United World College, and all these different countries all over the world have them. And Claire, Molly's daughter, who is a year older than Tara, had gone to Pearson United World College in British Columbia. So they get their senior year of high school and their freshman year of college, and they get, at the end of it, the International Baccalaureate, and then from there they can go on to university. And so Tara graduated from United World College, and she got a scholarship and went to Brown, and she graduated from Brown, and then her brother was getting his master's at the in architecture at the University of New Mexico, so she went there, and she got a master's in public policy. And then she worked for a think tank here in Denver, and she has a boyfriend that she met at the United World College, who is, by this time, a PhD in mechanical engineering, and he's teaching at the University of Arizona in Tucson. So she went into these people in this think tank in Denver and said, I have to quit because I'm moving to Tucson where my boyfriend is. And they said, you don't have to quit. This is the computer age, you can work from there. So she's actually an employee of a Denver think tank, but she lives in Tucson and writes papers and background material and stuff.
And your youngest child was a son?
My youngest child is my son, Pat, and Pat is a practicing Buddhist, and he lives in Crestone, Colorado, and he is the owner of and the principal of a small construction company called Paragon Contractors, and he builds churches and dormitories and motels, things of that nature, all in southern Colorado. He's also a certified, I can't think of what the initials are, but medical person. They do.
It'll come to me, physician's assistant?
Well, it's not a physician's assistant, no, it's there's some other kind of thing that it's a medically trained first aid emergency sort of thing.
Oh, CPR?
And all of that sort of thing. And so the Sangre de Cristo Mountains are right there where his company is, and so EMT, emergency medical technician, that's what it is. And so he's he is that as well as running his own company. And so when somebody gets lost in the Sangre de Cristos or falls off a cliff, he's the one that goes out with the rescue groups. And the way he ended up in Crestone is also interesting, is that this Outward Bound program had a regional headquarters in Crestone, and he went to an Outward Bound program and stayed there, and then ran his construction company. And there's a Buddhist retreat center and temple there, and he built a facility for them, and in that process became acquainted with the head Buddhist, and so he did that. And he was married. He's divorced now, but the woman he married had a small daughter, very young, and he adopted her, and then the two of them had 3 boys, and so the 4 children are part of my 11 grandchildren, and the 2 great-grandchildren.
Where do you have your family reunions? They must be eclectic.
You know, it's an interesting thing that my daughters did this. I didn't, but they decided when they were young girls in high school age, maybe even younger, that when they got married and had children, they wanted the children would all be cousins, and they wanted them to know each other and to be together. And so every year they get together, and it's sometimes in Paonia, Colorado, and they've also met in Canada at Molly's was sort of the hostess for that, and they've also met in Washington, but they haven't gone down to Crestone yet. But Pat's boys and his daughter, they attend all these things. They're very close. Because, in fact, when Claire got married to another McGill lawyer, and her maid of honor was Tara, her cousin. So that, and I think that, I'm pretty sure, yeah, that the best man when Molly's son Jasper got married was one of Megan's sons. So they're extremely close, and I've been to the family gatherings, but you know, I'm sort of the senior citizen. They're very nice to me. They call me Grampy, and they always come over and say, Grampy.
They don't call you Your Honor?
No, they call me Grampy, and they say, you know, can we get something for you, Grampy? And I said, well, can I play catch with somebody? He said, no, you sit here. So, but they're doing very well. All of them are, and I'm very proud of them, and I attribute that to their parents, not to me.
This oral history would not be worthy of publication if I didn't ask you to talk about your marriage of 26 years to Stephanie SHAFER, who's a very accomplished lawyer and an extraordinary journalist and writer.
Yes.
And I will ask you a general question, but with a little focus. You both have contributed very much to each other's professional lives as well as your own home lives.
Right.
Could you just talk about your marriage and touch on how it's affected both of your careers?
Oh. Stephanie is the most essential part of me. She is extremely talented, a lot smarter than I am, and she would be angry with me telling you this, but I will.
This is for publication.
Yes, I know. She graduated undergraduate in Italian studies at the University of Colorado with honors and Phi Beta Kappa. She also, at that time when she made the same sort of thing I did, at 18, she far too young, she got married, and she met this young man at a karate studio, and a girlfriend of hers wanted to take karate because to protect themselves walking around the campus at night and so forth. And so Stephanie went with her friend there, and Stephanie ended up as a black belt 2nd degree in karate. And she met this young man there, and they got married, and after undergraduate school, they operated a karate school in Boulder, and then he applied for medical school, and he went there, and Steffi went to law school. And Steffi graduated Order of the Coif and editor-in-chief of the University of Colorado Law Review. So she then, she was still married, well, I think she was still married at the time she graduated, but her then husband went to med school and in Denver, and he graduated, and he was doing a residency in Denver and ran off with a nurse. So they divorced, and she was single, and she became the law clerk to our mutual friend Joe Quinn, who was Chief Justice of the Colorado Supreme Court. And she was Justice Quinn's law clerk. And then because of this divorce, she was left with all kinds of bills, and she wasn't too sure what she wanted to do. And Don Bain at Home Robertson Owen hired her. And I'd left the firm by then. I was not a party to that, but she stayed at that firm, and she did banking and corporate law. And her mentor was Jim Owen, who was the son of one of the founders, Churchill Owen, and where my mentor there had been Pete Holm. Hers was Jim Owen, and she did bank regulatory work, and then she was made a partner, and she was a partner there for about a year or two, and decided that she wanted to go to med school. So she went back to the University of Colorado at Denver with an Italian studies degree. She had never taken any science courses, so she went back and took all these chemistry, physics, and advanced math courses, and took the MCAT, and as typical of her, she got A's in everything and scored very high. And then she was on the wait list at Tufts Medical School, but she wanted to go to CU Medical School, and one of the interviewers said that she had a law degree and he wasn't about to give a law degree to some lawyer to go out and sue doctors, and she had an opportunity to sue, but she decided not to, and she went from there to practice law, and she didn't, I think I'm correct, she didn't go back to Home Roberts at that time, but she started doing trial law, and she was one of co-counsel representing the guy who was the chief executive officer of Silverado,
Michael
Wise, and they went to trial in front of Judge Kerrigan, and I do know from Judge Kerrigan that Steffi cross-examined this bank examiner, and it was an FBI expert, and had him admit on the stand that he wasn't competent to give the opinion that he did. So Michael Wise was acquitted, largely because of, according to Judge Kerrigan, according to what Stephanie did. But she handled a couple of murder cases, and that's when I met her. And after the Michael Wise case, and I'd been single for about 5 years, and she'd been single for about 10 years, and we met at a mutual friend's house, and so within a year we got married. And she went back to Home Roberts for a short period of time, only not in the corporate department. She went in the litigation department, and she did that until she wrote her first novel. And so she left the practice of law and became a novelist, and she's had 4 novels published by Bantam, 2 of them, and Scribner, 2 of them, and she has another novel coming out in September that she's very busy promoting with things I don't know anything about, face something or other on the computer.
Not Facebook.
Facebook, and she's doing all this sort of stuff. I really don't know much what it is. But I have helped her in the sense that I've edited the manuscripts and discussed them with her. And the first 4 books are, well, 3 of them are, her heroine is a woman criminal defense attorney in Denver who is dyslexic, and she's a better lawyer because she's dyslexic. And to go back to what I was saying about Irving Andrews, not taking notes, this is sort of the inspiration for this, is that dyslexic people have a tendency to listen rather than to take notes because they don't read very much, and they retain stuff orally rather than orally, rather than reading it visually. And so I think that was part of it, and then part of it was her experience as a criminal defense attorney that went into formulating these original three novels about the dyslexic woman criminal defense attorney. The other novel was about a psychiatrist who was a sociopath, and that came about because of some people that I introduced her to, and eventually, and she knew some other psychiatrists and so on, and the subject came up, what do you do with a psychiatrist who's a psychopath? And so that's what that novel's about. And then we went a few years ago to Paris and Amsterdam on a vacation, and in Amsterdam both fell in love with that city, and the museum there is phenomenal, and right across from the State Museum is the Van Gogh Museum. And so we spent most of our time in Amsterdam going to art museums and looking and studying this. And then on the airplane on the way back, I can't sleep on planes, and she could, so she was, I thought, was sleeping, and all of a sudden she turns to me and she says, I'm going to write another novel. And she said, only this one is going to be about art. So her heroine in this forthcoming novel is a woman who's an art curator, and she solves a mystery murder by examining paintings and the techniques of artists and identifying eventually who the artist is that committed this horrible murder. So that's what she does.
Does she critique and edit any of your judicial opinions?
Yes, yes, she certainly does. If I have any opinion of any length at all, I bring it home, and she has improved my writing tenfold. So I will say this in all candor, she never has ever suggested to me how I should rule. She just doesn't do that. And I think that's a good habit she picked up working for Chief Justice Quinn. But she'd never done that, but she'll say, why do you want to put this part of this opinion here? Why doesn't it go in here? And she'll do things like that. She has an interesting history. She was born in Brooklyn, New York. Her parents were secular Jews, and her father was an international merchant. And when she went to high school, she crossed the Brooklyn Bridge every day going to the Elizabeth Irwin School, which is known to New Yorkers as the Little Red Schoolhouse. It's a school that was started by teachers in the New York public school system during the McCarthy era who were fired because they had belonged to pinko organizations. So they set up this school, and that's where she went to high school. And she was fluent in French before she graduated from high school, and then she studied Italian in college and French, and she's very good in English, French, and Italian. And when her mother passed away, and her father was living alone and not doing well in their family home in Brooklyn, and we inveigled him and finally got him to move out here. And he lived in Denver, and he did not live with us, but he lived in a secure living place, whatever the euphemism is for that, about 1.5 miles away from where we live. And so we took care of him during his final 5 years of life. And she was very, very devoted to him, very good to him. And my mother was a widow, and Steffi was very, very helpful with her. And I used to take my mom out before I met Stephanie, and then I'd have dinner with her at least once a week and take her shopping and to her doctor's appointments and things. And then Stephanie helped with that after we got married, and I would still go and take her to the doctors and that sort of thing. And then I was diagnosed with cancer, and I went into...
When was that?
That was in,
2003?
2003. You're right. And so I went in and it was breast cancer, which is very unusual for men to have it, but I did. And when I was diagnosed, within a week I was having surgery and a mastectomy, and then I went through chemo, and it was chemotherapy is especially then, it's not as bad now, but the reactions to the chemotherapy are bad. It's like having severe flu, only it lasts for 6 months. And you're just sick as a dog. And I couldn't continue taking care of my mom, so I called my sister, who lives in Monterey, California, and she came out and she said, "You've been taking care of Mom for 10 years, it's my turn." And so they went back to Monterey, and that's where my mother was for about the last 4 years of her life, until she passed away. And then I just finished the chemotherapy, and that's something else. I don't know if we ever discussed this before. Judge Mage, before I was diagnosed with cancer, Judge Mage was afflicted with a strange kind of a disorder where see if I can remember this right, but coming from the gallbladder, I believe it's the gallbladder, but coming from there into the liver are these ducts and sort of like veins or arteries, and they started to harden and to close, and it required him to have a liver transplant. So he, at the University of Colorado, when it was still at 8th in Colorado, before it became the Anschutz Center out in Aurora, he had a liver transplant, and in doing so, I won't go into the rest of it because it's his business, but what he did when he was diagnosed and knew he was going to be out for a while, the only time in his life he ever did this, he scheduled a press conference. And I asked him at the time, I said, "This is so unlike you to have a press conference." And he said, "Yeah." He said, "I don't like it." But he said, "If I don't do this," he said, "the rumors are going to spread throughout the whole legal community and the courts and every place else about me, and that I'm dying or I'm doing something else, and it's going to be a lot of misinformation and rumors." So he said, "I think the best thing that you can do if you are at all a public figure is to disclose what it is." So that's what he did. And he said he had a press conference and he told them all that he'd been diagnosed and what it was, and that he was going in and have a liver transplant, and why. He did not, I don't think, go into great detail, but one detail is essential, and that's that in the liver transplant they removed the pancreas. So by surgery he became a surgically induced diabetic, because the pancreas produces insulin, and so he is now, and has been since then, a diabetic. but he takes care of himself. And so when I was diagnosed, I vividly remembered what he had done. So I had a press conference and said, I've got breast cancer and I'm going to have surgery and I'm going to be in chemo for 6 months, and then I plan on coming back. And that's what I did. So I've been under treatment since then, since 2003. And my cancer went into remission until I think it was October or November of 2017, and it flared up again. So rather than have chemotherapy, the techniques for treating it had changed by then, but the metastasis was in my lymph system and one vertebrae. And so I was back on regular treatments, and I am to this day. I take medication every day, and once a month I have an injection, and once every 3 months I have an infusion. And I'm scheduled for an infusion on Friday. So I go in and they stick a needle in my arm and put this fluid in there, and it makes me sick as a dog for about 4 or 5 hours, then I'm through with that.
I have to ask my concluding question, and because you're still a sitting judge, you can have the last word, but my concluding question is this. You've had all of these physical issues that caused you to take senior status in 1988, and you've had these issues with cancer since 2003, yet you continue to sit very actively as a senior United States District Judge. Why? Why do you do that?
Well, the choice was, I suppose I could be medically retired and not have any judicial duties, but fortunately I can remain as a senior judge and work, and I'm very grateful that I can. But to put it into a nutshell, Article 3 of the Constitution appoints a judge for life, and I think that's a two-way street. When I took it, I was fully aware of the fact that I was becoming a judge for the rest of my life. And so I think that other judges can retire if they want to, but I'm not going to. Again, I wish he were a clone, but my dear friend Judge Mage feels the same way about it. It's a two-way street. You're appointed for life, we're going to serve for life. So I will be, unless the dementia gets to the point where I can't do anything or I'm drooling in my soup, I plan on doing this until I'm carted out.
You enjoy coming to work and being a judge?
I do. I'm very grateful. I think I'm one of the luckiest people that ever lived. I think I'm one of the luckiest people living. It certainly doesn't happen all the time, but when you have a case and it's over either by an opinion or by a jury verdict, and you have the sense that justice has been done, there's no feeling that even can compare with that. And I have seen justice done. It is not done in every case, but that's the ambition. That's the target, to try and reach justice in every case. And I just think I'm extraordinarily lucky. I was lucky to have been appointed, and I've been lucky to live with the various medical problems I've had. And I'm lucky to have a wife who's very supportive, and I have a abiding admiration and affection for lawyers who practice law with ethics and with dedication to their clients. And as a branch of philosophy, I think jurisprudence is the thing that interests me more than anything else. So why wouldn't I be doing what I like to do?
Well, we civilians are very lucky to have your public service. Those are all my questions, but you do, by the power vested in you, have the right to a last word.
Well, I think I just gave it. I appreciate Chief Judge Timkovich wanting this done. I appreciate the legal aid, or the Historical Society for doing it, and knowing how many demands there are on your time. I'm gratefully, really, truly appreciative of the effort and the time you've spent, and the staff of the court system that is videotaping this and going through it. Has been great. I like the special treatment I've received.
It's been our honor and our privilege. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I guess we're done.
I think we're done.
Okay.